We'll speak from the standpoint of the engineering work that we've done over the last several years, my personal experience in working at a programmatic level with the UN, as well as working at the community level in various sized communities, small, medium, and large, and also working with small and mid-sized businesses as well on their resiliency. So let me get started. I really want to touch on really kind of three areas, if at all possible. One is on, just ground truthing us a bit on some of the climate concerns that we have. Talking a bit about the scorecard, which was developed as a facilitating tool to bring diverse stakeholders together to develop a plan. It's not perfect by any stretch, but it's a tool to get stakeholders. So I want to go through that a bit, some of the background on it, and then just give an overview of some of the activities at the international level and the various almost 3,000 cities that have joined the UN program calling Making My City Resilient campaign. That represents almost 1 billion people in those 3,000 cities. And some of the other UN work that's going on. It's really quite exciting. I've been on the board for the UN Private Sector Advisory Group for about 4 years, and I've stepped off the board now because I really want to focus more on local regional issues. Enough at the 50,000 foot level. Of course, resilience, right? I talk about resilience and I talk about adaptation. I don't necessarily get off into the area of climate change. And so this is a calibration. Resilience is an inescapable attribute of a smarter planet. Resilience requires planning and adaptation in advance of an impact. And when we look at the number of natural disasters that have occurred over the last 30 years, you see a very significant increase, almost a 4x increase from 30 years. Now, there are really three major driving forces that have caused a lot of concern. One is the increased frequency of events. This is Munich Re data, an increased frequency of events. A second thing is urbanization. 100 years ago, only 10% of the population lived in cities. We're at 50%, we're going to 70%. China's creating 3 cities the size of Chicago every year. India, at least 1 city of 10 million or more. And then finally, the massive amount of capital losses, 70% of which are uninsured. So the capital losses have really, you see here depicted, have really escalated as well. And so much of the investment in a city or a community is from the private sector. And so we definitely have a stake in attacking resilience together being public and private, to achieve a better outcome. There's an adage that a fool learns from his own mistake and a wise person learns from the mistakes of others. And I think we have ample opportunity to learn from what's transpired in the last few years. If we just look at 2014, there were nearly 1,000 disasters that occurred. It's interesting that to me that in North America we had 20% of the events. We incurred 29% of the losses, but yet almost 60% of the losses were insured. When you contrast that to Asia, 37% of the events, but 75% of the deaths, and 46% of the losses. So there is a disproportional effect from these natural disasters, which does create a tremendous opportunity for sharing of best practices, both in preparation, in response, and in recovery. Interesting enough, UNISDR put out a little flyer, which I can distribute to you after this event, but they tabulated the number of events that occurred by country. And surprisingly, China had the most number of natural disasters in the last 9 years, 2005, 2014, which would really be 10 years. I looked at that as a percent of gross domestic product. Now this is the cumulative impact over that 10-year period against their annual GDP. So it's not really looking at a 10-year GDP. But it does give a contrast. I think we're seeing some important financial impacts from this kind of comparison. Cities, and I don't really need to tell this audience that, are really complex systems. Um, it's food storage and delivery, food security, cybersecurity, healthcare, ecosystem services, highly integrated. And we really need to understand these interdependencies when we talk about and think about resilience. And each system typically has different owners. This was really brought home to me on a workshop I did in San Francisco about 5 years ago, where it was a workshop on resiliency with the public and the private sector. We had about 40 people in attendance, half from the city, half from the community, from businesses. And each of the areas had interest in resilience and had an ownership of a piece of it, but really didn't know each other and weren't working in any kind of cooperation. Resilience is really a process that not only spans many activities, but many years to achieve. It would be nice if it could be fixed by this afternoon. Not the case. This just shows some of the pre-planning event, some of the event planning after. Because it's enough when a disaster does occur and we throw response at it and we try to be as effective as we can, but then how fast can we recover? That is so critical. The Kobe port was one of the busiest ports in the world. After the major earthquake, I think they're number 27 or 28 now, despite massive investment. They've been unable to recover as quickly, and it's had economic impacts. So if you could measure resilience across all the systems, it would allow a city to really not only identify exposures, but track progress. And as Kristen pointed out, really get more engaged in capital expenditures, where you can really make a difference with every expenditure. When we look at how we can bring the community and the private sector and the government enterprise together, there are many different opportunities for collaboration and cooperation. Often communication is a tremendous challenge, however. We learned with Toyota the billion-dollar impact to their business with the Thailand floods due to the interruption of their supply chain. And we've relearned this several times since. So again, there is a very inherent reason for cooperation and collaboration between the public and the private sector. So now let's come back to looking at this idea of the scorecard. The United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Risk Reduction really defined what they call the 10 essentials of disaster risk reduction. Were they perfect or complete? No. Do they provide some good mileposts, guideposts for us? Yes. And so after the workshop I mentioned in San Francisco, we were doing a debrief after, and we said, we have really no way of gauging where are we. San Francisco is a very active community. They have an annual disaster event activity. But where are we on the continuum of being prepared? And so we sat down with our partners at IBM and really developed out this scorecard designed around the 10 essentials. It was a tremendous help to us not to have to invent the essentials. Now, this is the second generation of the 10 essentials, just recently updated after the Sendai framework. It's about 95% consistent. We led that process. There were stakeholders for each of the essentials, from the universities to the Red Cross to private sector. So it was a very integrated process. But let me translate this a little further. I will, but I'll do that here. Because you can categorize them into three major areas: corporate and city governance, which is really organized for disaster resilience, identify, understand, and use current, future risk scenarios. One of the things that we found to be so important is to really conceptualize what could happen. What is the scenarios that could occur? We do work, of course, in a number of venues, but often we'll plan for an earthquake or we'll plan for a hurricane, but we plan for a hurricane earthquake together. And those kinds of events are now occurring. Strength and financial capacity for resilience kind of fall under that corporate city governance realm. 4 is pursue resilient urban development and design, safeguard natural buffers to enhance the protective functions offered by natural ecosystems, strengthen institutional capacity for resilience, understand and strengthen society capacity for resilience, and increase infrastructure resilience, all kind of falling under that integrated planning perspective. And then response planning, really looking at ensure that there's effective disaster response and making sure that we can expedite recovery. And if appropriate, build back better. In some cases, there's no reason to build back in some of these venues. Thank goodness you'll get all these slides, right? The 10 essentials and how they apply. I wanted to just say there are 81 measurements that we put into the scorecard. And we looked at one point about weighting each of these 81 in terms of creating an algorithm. But we shied away from that because we didn't want City A to compare to City B. We wanted this to be a planning tool for the city and the community. And so this is kind of a typical approach, a scoring from 0 to 5, with wanting to document or justify, if you will, the scoring. Sometimes we all have blind spots, and we'll say, "Oh, I'm 5, I'm great at that." Well, where's the proof of that? And so here's another one as an example for Essential 10. But again, there are 81 of these. We're also doing something now in the city of New Orleans, which I'm very excited about, and we'll have the results by March, is we're looking at developing a scorecard for small and mid-sized businesses and looking at 6 historic corridors in New Orleans. And we'll be interviewing hundreds of small businesses to assess 10 years after Katrina, where are they in their resilience, what can the city do to help them, and what can they do to help themselves. Interesting program. So resilience is a large and growing concept. There's a convergence of interests around this area, I think driven by the increased frequency of events, the severity of the events, urbanization, and also capital losses. I'll skip over the Donald Rumsfeld comment because I want to show you a couple of things.
It was not done by Donald Rumsfeld.
Yeah.
That's inaccurate. I heard it
Thank
first
you.
in 1980.
All right, I'll get with you and get the right name.
Before that as well.
Okay.
Yeah, it was way back.
Okay, good.
Actually, we can't find the origin.
I know.
So the scorecard did get recognized by Notre Dame this last year as well as the 2015 prize, which we felt good about. Now, I just wanted to do a couple of things here. We did a one-day program for the city of Stamford, Connecticut, and this is kind of a typical output that comes from the scorecard process. You identify, high scores are good, low scores are bad. It really was done working with Stamford 2030. The mayor was very involved in this and very supportive, and the right decision makers were in the room for that one day, and we really achieved a tremendous amount of results for that effort. We've also done 2-day workshops. This is a group in Indonesia, and a different output from that. You see they're very low in risk assessment, thinking about the perils that they could be subjected to, reasonably strong in protecting ecosystems and natural buffers. And again, this is raw material to be used to develop a plan. It's not the plan itself. We've also, with EU funding, applied this to several cities in Europe to really kind of sanity check the scorecard. And based on that, we've come up with a second edition. And again, the scorecard is in the public domain. IBM and AECOM did this pro bono. It was issued by the UN in March of 2014. It's on the UN website, so it's readily available. So you see 2 cities in the UK, 1 in Portugal, and 2 in Sweden, and really got some very valuable feedback. And this was not a 1-day program, not a 2-day program, but a few-week program. We also have worked with FEMA in the city of Charlotte and looked at how we could integrate the scorecard assessment for 7 communities in the hazard mitigation planning. This was kind of a pilot experiment, and I think it really did yield some good results. I'll skip that. This shows the linkage of the essentials and the HMP. As I mentioned, we've probably done 3 or 4 different, dozen at least, scorecard applications around the world. Most recently, we're doing Mexico City as part of the RC100 program. And again, it just shows some of the variation that comes out of this to help identify priorities and sense of direction. Another one recently completed in Chile. So the scorecard is not a perfect tool, but it's one that gets people together talking about resilience in a structured kind of format. And it's likely to be useful to develop a resiliency plan that may take 1, 3, 5, 10 years to implement. Now, I didn't talk about this Sendai framework, but the slides are here. I will flash through them. The UN's been involved in this after 2004 tsunami in Thailand. The Hyoga framework was established to be succeeded by the Sendai framework, which 187 member states, countries approved in March. The General Assembly of the UN approved in June. And it really talks about one goal, 4 priorities, and 7 targets that are really quite specific to be measured in the 2015 to 2030 horizon. So the private sector has been involved in this at the Secretary General's urging. These are some of the ways that we're involved. We have an organization called Arise, which is a group of over 100 multinational companies that are working in the private sector to help in this area. And we've got a number of different work streams that have key deliverables over the next, we took it out to 2020, which I have put into the appendix to see. They're draft, but you can go through and see them. So there we go. I can breathe now.
Okay, thanks, Dale. So take 2 quick questions. Let's go with Igor and Laura.
Scorecard, of course, it's a good approach, but it has many limitations. For example, you cannot use it in optimization. You can only use it as a snapshot of what's going on. Metrics are all treated equally. They're not equal. Some of them are more important, so it doesn't allow values, for example, and adjustment for specific situation. So, of course, I applaud this effort. It's a really good first step, but I think it's very important not to stop there. It may be useful. We should clearly think about limitation of that and move forward. Of course, I can map resilience matrix or map scorecard and resilience matrix, and it will allow more flexibility. But again, it's a good tool. It's great work, and it's important first step.
Well, thank you. And it's just a working tool. You know, there's an adage that if you don't know where you're going, any path will get you there. This does provide a framework, as loose as it is. But thank you for that comment.
Laura.
I have a question about how the metrics were selected and developed. Were they brought together from different indices? Were they tested against something or based on data?
The metrics for the scorecard?
Yeah, the 81 things that you
Yes.
measure.
We went to the 10 essentials and debated.
Okay, so how are even those, I guess?
Yeah, the 10 essentials were developed by the UN and a cross-functional group. And when they came to updating them at Sendai, each of the essentials had teams of people internationally. The Red Cross took one essential, for example, and really worked at how to refine it and create better definition. London University got involved as well with another essential. So it's a very iterative process.